February 15th, 1994, Indianapolis, Indiana. While waiting for her school bus, 11-year-old LaShonna Bates walks into a nearby shop, but she soon vanishes without a trace. A month and a half later, LaShonna's remains are found in a wooded area 8 miles away, and it is determined that she has a skull fracture and her cause of death is blunt force trauma. In 2000, Charles Daughtery, the man who found LaShonna's remains, is charged with her murder after he confesses to the crime. However, Charles recants his confession, and after it is ruled to be inadmissible as evidence, the charges are dropped, and LaShonna's murder is never conclusively solved. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Werder, and on this episode, we're going to be exploring a cold case involving an 11-year-old girl, the 1994 murder of LaShonna Bates. This coming weekend, I'm going to be appearing at the initial AdvocacyCon event in Indianapolis, and per tradition, whenever I attend one of these podcasting events, I always like to do an episode about a case from the event's host city that very same week. While the murder of LaShonna Bates is one of the saddest stories we've ever covered, as she went missing on her way to school one morning before her remains were found in a wooded area several weeks later. Charles Daughtery, the man who found LaShonna's remains and called the police, would eventually be charged with her murder after he made a full confession, but, and stop me if you've heard this one before, Charles would recant his confession as he had a very low IQ and claimed he had been coerced by the police. The case against Charles fell apart, but it turned out that LaShonna hailed from a broken home, as her mother's boyfriend, Archie Jackson, had a documented history of abuse and supposedly acted inappropriately towards LaShonna shortly before she went missing. While the murder charges against Charles were ultimately dropped, he was never officially cleared as a suspect, so there's always been debate about whether Charles actually did this or if Archie is a much more likely candidate to have been the killer. Whatever the case, there have not been any major developments in the investigation over the past 2 decades, and LaShonna's story seems to have faded from the spotlight, so we're going to explore all the different angles on today's episode. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube Music, Podcast Addict, and more. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, including stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content, as our Patreon page has around 80 exclusive bonus episodes and archives, which are not available in a regular feed. So with all that out of the way, let us now delve into the murder of LaShonna Bates. Our story begins in Indianapolis, Indiana in 1994, and our victim is 11-year-old LaShonna Bates. LaShonna was born to parents Robert Bates and Teresa Gaskin and has a total of 2 brothers and 2 sisters. At this particular point, Robert and Teresa are no longer together, and LaShonna is living with her mother and Teresa's boyfriend Archie Jackson at a residence on South Illinois Street in the near South Side neighborhood. LaShonna is currently a 4th grader at Indianapolis Public School 46, but while this is her first year at that school and she is described as being shy, she turned out to be particularly skilled at swimming when her class was allowed to use the pool at George Washington High School. On Tuesday, February the 15th, LaShonna was scheduled to go back to the pool and would be using the diving board for the first time, so she left her home that morning and walked to a stop on the corner of Arizona and Meridian Streets in order to wait for her bus. According to other kids who were waiting there, LaShonna walked into a nearby Village Pantry convenience store, but by the time the school bus arrived at 8:42 a.m., she had still not come out. Even though some of LaShonna's friends yelled towards the store that the bus was there, she did not re-emerge, so they climbed onto the bus and it left without her. Well, LaShonna never arrived at school that day and was marked absent, and while they attempted to call Teresa to ask where LaShonna was, they were unable to reach her. LaShonna did not return home that evening, and when she failed to resurface by 6 p.m., Teresa contacted the Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department, aka the IMPD, to officially report her missing. An extensive search of the area failed to turn up LaShonna, but a blue coat which was identified as belonging to her was found in an alley on West Wisconsin Street. LaShonna's classmates were left pretty devastated by her disappearance, so throughout the rest of the school year, her desk in her classroom was kept empty on the chance that she would return safely. LaShonna remained a missing person for a month and a half, but at around 2 p.m. on April the 5th, police received a 911 call from a man named Charles Daughtery, who said he had come across what appeared to be the badly decomposed remains of an African-American child in a wooded area located between Euclid and Drexel Avenue and just south of Massachusetts Avenue in the Near East Side neighborhood. When police arrived at the scene and viewed the body, they noticed that the victim had a bare torso, but she was clad in red sweatpants and white socks, while a pair of white tennis shoes and some hair barrettes were found about 10 feet away. There was a bit of initial skepticism about the remains belonging to LaShonna, since witnesses had recalled her wearing black pants rather than red pants before she went missing. However, on April the 29th, 3 weeks after the remains were found, DNA testing officially confirmed that they belonged to LaShonna. An autopsy determined that she was the victim of a homicide, and her exact cause of death was blunt force trauma, as her skull had been fractured. The wooded area was located approximately 8 miles from where LaShonna was last seen alive. While it was determined that LaShonna likely died sometime on February the 15th, the same day she disappeared, a forensic entomologist from Purdue University used the reproduction rate of some blue bottle fly eggs found in the woods to determine that LaShonna's body was likely placed at the scene no earlier than February the 18th and no later than February the 20th. Just over 1 week after the discovery of her remains, LaShonna was laid to rest at a funeral which was attended by more than 300 people, many of whom didn't even know her but had heard about her death in the media. Over the course of the next few years, plans were made to memorialize LaShonna and her swimming skills by constructing a new facility which would be adjacent to Indianapolis Public School 46, and in 1997, the LaShonna Bates Aquatic Center was finally completed. The investigation into LaShonna's murder remained at a standstill for years, but in 2000, the case wound up in the hands of the IMPD's Cold Case Unit and was assigned to veteran homicide detective Sergeant Roy West. Well, on November the 1st, the police announced that they had finally arrested a suspect, 29-year-old Charles Daughtery, the very same man who had reported the discovery of LaShonna's remains. It turned out that investigators always had their suspicions about Charles, who was a convicted sex offender. In 1991, Charles had pled guilty to child molestation for assaulting a male relative, and he received a 4-year suspended sentence and 4 years probation. Even though Charles wound up violating his probation in 1995 and served 2 years in prison, he was still a free man during the time period LaShonna went missing. At the time of his arrest, Charles had a wife and 2 stepchildren and worked 2 jobs at both Burger King and a Bob Evans restaurant. Back in 1994, Charles happened to live in the same neighborhood as LaShonna, but investigators always found it to be an odd coincidence that he would just happen to stumble across her remains in a wooded area located in another section of the city 8 miles away. Charles gave conflicting accounts about why he was even in the woods to begin with, as he initially claimed that he had been chasing his girlfriend's dog, but then said he was looking for another random dog he had spotted in the area. Charles also told police that he had found the remains at around noon, but since the discovery upset him so much, he did not actually call 911 until 2 p.m. Shortly after the case was reassigned to Sergeant Roy West, he decided to bring in Charles for questioning on October the 30th, and after interrogating him for 13 hours, Charles finally confessed to the crime. He claimed that on the morning of LaShonna's disappearance, he had kidnapped her from the alley behind the village pantry convenience store where she was last seen. After raping LaShonna in the back seat of his car, Charles said that he held LaShonna in captivity for several hours and proceeded to drive around and rape her 4 more times at various locations. When it started to get dark, Charles took LaShonna into the wooded area where she was found and tried to rape her again, but she attempted to fight him off, which prompted Charles to grab a rock and bash her skull twice until she was dead. After leaving LaShonna in the woods, Charles returned to the location a month and a half later in order to, quote-unquote, discover her remains and then call 911. According to police, Charles shared enough incriminating details to suggest that he had inside knowledge of the crime, such as him tossing LaShonna's coat into an alley on West Wisconsin Street. After Charles signed a statement admitting his culpability in the murder, the police temporarily released him from custody and placed him under surveillance before they formally arrested him at his home the following morning on the charges of murder, felony murder, and child molestation. A press conference was soon held outside the LaShonna Bates Aquatic Center, where Indianapolis Mayor Bart Peterson and Police Chief Jerry Barker praised the department's cold case unit for solving the case. After entering pleas of not guilty to all the charges, Charles would be held at the Marion County Jail to await trial, but it wasn't long before he recanted his confession and questions started to arise about the validity of his arrest. Charles had a serious intellectual disability and his IQ was only 67, so he claimed his confession was coerced, and that after being interrogated for 13 hours, he only told the police what they wanted to hear in order to make the whole ordeal stop. Charles said the police told him he would be allowed to go home if he signed a statement, so he agreed to comply without even really understanding what he was signing. Indeed, the evidence did not seem to support some of the details of Charles's confession, as even though he claimed he raped LaShonna no less than 5 times, she did not have any vaginal tears or injuries, and no seminal fluid was found on her body or clothing. There were also no witnesses who reported seeing Charles and LaShonna together that day, even though he had supposedly driven around with her for several hours, and the assaults took place inside his car in broad daylight. While some aspects of Charles's confession were accurate, like his description of LaShonna's clothing and the discovery of her coat in an alley, those details had already been reported in the newspapers and were public knowledge. Charles remained incarcerated for 2 years to await trial, but on November 27, 2002, Superior Court Judge Patricia Gifford ruled that Charles's confession had been obtained illegally. Judge Gifford felt that Charles's low IQ made him incapable of waiving his right against self-incrimination, stating, quote, "The confession of the defendant was not a product of rational intellect and free will and was therefore not voluntary," end quote. As a result, the confession would be inadmissible as evidence at Charles's upcoming trial. Gifford also used this opportunity to criticize the IMPD for a sloppy investigation and making a number of crucial errors. For instance, the police never collected any of the security tapes from the village pantry convenience store that LaShonna had entered before she went missing. They also lost LaShonna's coat, even though it could have conceivably contained hair or fiber evidence that either linked Charles to the crime or cleared him as a suspect. Other than Charles's confession, prosecutors did not seem to have any other evidence to take him to trial, so they elected to drop all charges against him, and he was released from jail on December 4th. Teresa Gaskin expressed her outrage at this turn of events, as she still believed that Charles was guilty, and stated during an interview, quote, "It was just a big old screw-up. If I was a person who really didn't care, if I had a gun right now, if I see him, I would probably shoot him. But you know, she wouldn't want me to do that. It seems like the system failed me and her. In a way, I feel that if one of the guys was black and she was white, they would have went to trial and hung him," end quote. Well, shortly after Teresa made those comments, Charles's defense attorney, Jane Rumel, publicly revealed a number of reasons why Teresa's live-in boyfriend, Archie Jackson, was a much better suspect than her client. It turned out that LaShonna had a tumultuous childhood with her mother, as at the age of 2, she and her siblings were temporarily removed from Teresa's home by child welfare services because it was infested by roaches and maggots. Teresa's children were eventually returned to her, but when LaShonna was 5 years old, she had to be hospitalized for what were described as, quote-unquote, suspicious burns on her body. In 1993, Archie Jackson moved in with Teresa and 3 of her children, but it wasn't long before child welfare services became involved again due to allegations of abuse from Archie. LaShonna's brother and sister were removed from the home, but since there was no apparent signs that LaShonna herself was being personally abused, she was allowed to remain with Teresa and Archie. However, child welfare officials would describe Teresa as being, quote-unquote, ambivalent about her responsibilities as a parent, because even though the courts ruled that Teresa could not regain custody of her other two children while Archie was still living in her house, she refused to kick him out. It would later be alleged that Archie had been abusive towards LaShonna, as there was one incident where he supposedly made LaShonna strip to her underwear and stand in a closet for 5 minutes before he beat her with an extension cord. Well, it turned out that on the night before LaShonna went missing, Archie had allegedly made an attempt to, quote-unquote, sexually exploit her, and he also told LaShonna that he would take her to live with her grandmother the following weekend. When LaShonna told her mother about Archie's actions, she confronted him and warned him not to do it again. The following morning, Archie did not show up for work as scheduled, and it was reported that he had a weak alibi during the time period when LaShonna was believed to have vanished. Archie had previously worked for the Indianapolis Fruit Company, which was located on Massachusetts Avenue, right next to the wooded area where LaShonna's remains were ultimately found. When police performed a search of the trunk of his 1985 Oldsmobile, they uncovered some red fibers, which seemed to be consistent with fibers from the red sweatpants LaShonna had been wearing when her body was found. In spite of this, investigators did not believe there was sufficient evidence to charge Archie with LaShonna's murder. Archie refused to speak to the media about the case, though his mother accused the police of harassing him and expressed her belief that Charles Daughtery was a much better suspect. Unfortunately, the investigation into LaShonna's case seemed to reach a complete standstill after the murder charges against Charles were dropped. As far as I can tell, the last time this case got mentioned in the media was in May of 2019, during an article about Roy West, the homicide detective who arrested Charles. West had retired from the IMPD at the end of 2007 before he became an investigator who assisted homicide prosecutors, and he was now retiring for good after 47 years of service. Even though West had solved over 150 cases throughout the course of his career, he cited LaShonna's murder as the one case which he was most upset to leave open. He stated, quote, "You have two primary suspects. One could be just as guilty as the other. One was the person who found the body, Charles Daughtery. It's frustrating in that sense, knowing that you're at the door, but you can't get in. And obviously, you have one that admitted to the killing, but there's issues with his mental health, and the other is highly suspected of being involved because of the activities that were going on inside the home." End quote. While West did not specifically mention Archie Jackson's name, it was heavily implied that he was the second suspect. But unfortunately, there have not been any new developments in quite some time, and after more than 30 years, the truth about who is actually responsible for the murder of LaShonna Bates remains unknown. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. So the most difficult episodes for me to put together are ones in which children go missing or are murdered, but they are especially disturbing if the victim had suffered abuse in their own household and may have been killed by one of their so-called caregivers. Even if they are not officially solved, the solution in many of these cases often seems pretty cut and dried, but what has really muddied the waters in the LaShonna Bates case is that a suspect outside her home wound up being charged with her murder after what was obviously a very questionable confession. If you look at the original media coverage of this case, there was no mention of LaShonna having led a troubled home life until late 2002, which is when the murder charges against Charles Daughtery were dismissed and he was released from jail. Up until that point, nobody ever publicly expressed any suspicion that LaShonna may have been killed by someone from her home, but Charles's defense attorney wanted to divert suspicion away from her client by pointing the finger at Archie Jackson as an alternate suspect. At the time LaShonna went missing, Archie had been the live-in boyfriend of LaShonna's mother, Teresa Gaskin, who came across as a sympathetic figure on the surface, but it was troubling to learn that there were allegations of abuse and neglect towards LaShonna and her siblings long before Archie even entered their lives. It's been reported that Teresa had 5 children in total, But while we know that LaShonna's father was a man named Robert Bates, it's unclear if he was the father of all 5 of the children or if Teresa had them with multiple men. But we know that when she was only 2 years old, LaShonna and her siblings had to be removed from her mother's care due to neglect, and LaShonna had to be hospitalized for suspicious burns at age 5, though I'm not sure if it was ever conclusively established where those burns came from or if they were the result of domestic abuse. When Archie moved in with Teresa, she was living with LaShonna and 2 of her siblings, but the siblings had to be removed from the home because of Archie's abuse, and I find it troubling that LaShonna was allowed to keep living there just because there was no apparent evidence that Archie was directly abusing her. Shouldn't all children be kept away from a potentially dangerous individual like that, regardless of whether or not he harmed her? Child welfare services describe Teresa as being an ambivalent parent, and of course, one of the biggest WTF moments in this whole story is that Archie reportedly made an attempt to quote-unquote sexually exploit LaShonna the night before she went missing, and Teresa's only response was to warn Archie not to do it again. I'm sure most parents would say that if their child ever accused their partner of doing something like that, that person would be out the door in a heartbeat. In retrospect, it seems like too much of a coincidence that LaShonna just happened to vanish the day after this incident took place, and when you hear the allegations about how Archie once made LaShonna strip down to her underwear before he beat her with an extension cord, it makes you wonder if he might have done much worse to her, and Archie became paranoid that LaShonna was going to tell someone about it. Unfortunately, I have no idea of the current whereabouts of Teresa Gaskin and Archie Jackson, or if they're even still together, but ironically enough, I saw a photograph of Teresa in the January 4th, 2016 edition of the Indianapolis Star, as she could be seen standing in the crowd at a vigil, being held for the 4 victims of a quadruple homicide which had taken place in the city the previous March. When the murder charges against Charles Daughtery were dropped back in 2002, Teresa expressed her belief that Charles was her daughter's killer, but I'd be curious to hear if she still feels the same way today. Or alternatively, perhaps she has always known more about LaShonna's murder than she is letting on, but has kept her mouth shut for 3 decades. This issue has never been addressed in any of the sources I've found, but I've always found it a bit odd that LaShonna was in the 4th grade at age 11, which is older than usual for someone at that level, and makes me wonder if her troubled childhood may have caused some issues which led to her being held back a few years. But even though LaShonna was described as being shy and had not been at Indianapolis Public School 46 for very long, it sounds like she was very well liked by everyone there, and they were left pretty devastated by her death. While this is a very tragic story, I suppose the one silver lining is that LaShonna's legacy has been memorialized by having the LaShonna Bates Aquatic Center named after her, and since the building is still standing in Indianapolis all these years later, this ensures that she will never be forgotten. However, I still find it sad that if you do an internet search on LaShonna Bates' name, most of the matches from the past 2 decades are going to be for the Aquatic Center rather than the investigation into her murder, which seems to have ground to a dead halt. Much like Teresa and Archie, I have no idea of Charles Daughtery's whereabouts or what he's been up to since the charges were dropped and he was released from jail 22 years ago. Even though Archie Jackson is a compelling alternate suspect, I've always had this fear that the police would refuse to admit that they made a mistake and continue to maintain that Charles was the right guy all along. And they would take on the mindset that without any further evidence against Charles to bring him to trial, there really wasn't anything more they could do. Surprisingly, Roy West, the veteran homicide detective who arrested Charles, was willing to admit right before his retirement in 2019 that Charles wasn't the only viable suspect, but that doesn't mean West's actions during the original investigation were not questionable. All that being said, even though I have covered numerous cases on this podcast in which an innocent suspect was coerced into making a confession to a crime they did not commit, Charles Daughtery has technically never been proven to be innocent or fully exonerated. I definitely believe that Charles never should have been charged with LaShonna's murder on the basis of a questionable confession without any real corroborating evidence, but I will admit that there were still a few suspicious things about Charles which prevent me from ruling him out entirely. Let's also not forget that Charles was once charged with child molestation for abusing a male relative, so he definitely had issues. However, let's look at the full circumstances of how LaShonna went missing. The story shared by LaShonna's classmates is that LaShonna followed her usual routine of walking to the bus stop at the corner of Arizona and Meridian Streets in order to catch a ride to school, and she decided to walk into a nearby Village Pantry convenience store. But by the time the bus arrived, LaShonna had still not exited the store, and even though some of her friends claimed that they yelled out that the bus was here, she never came out and wound up missing it. It sounds like LaShonna had an exemplary attendance record and only missed one day of school that year, and it would have been very out of character for her not to show up. So could something have happened to her before the bus arrived? Well, the story provided by Charles Daughtery during his confession is that he abducted LaShonna from an alley behind the store, but if you believe Archie Jackson was the perpetrator, he could have shown up there and convinced LaShonna not to board the bus, possibly by offering her a ride to school. Whatever the case, it does not sound like there were any witnesses who have placed Charles or Archie in the area that day, and it blows my mind that the police did not obtain any of the security tapes which were recorded at the store, as this could have provided conclusive answers about what happened. And another detail which strikes me as odd is that when Charles was arrested in 2000, police announced that they were trying to track down an older, gray-haired woman wearing glasses who had supposedly been working as a clerk at the convenience store on the morning LaShonna went missing, as they felt she might have some important information. So, why didn't they speak to this person 6 years earlier? It seems to me like investigators should have checked with this person before Charles was charged with murder, because if the clerk had seen LaShonna in the company of another person that morning, this could have blown their whole case. I find it very frustrating that the last location where LaShonna was confirmed to be alive was a public place in broad daylight, which may have had numerous witnesses around, yet the only version of events we've ever heard is that she went into the store but never came back out. As far as I can tell, there was not one reported sighting of LaShonna after she entered the store that day, so it's still a big mystery how she wound up dead in a wooded area located 8 miles away. Anyway, Archie did not show up for work as scheduled that morning and was described as having a quote-unquote weak alibi, though we don't have any more specific details. But theoretically, if Archie had been abusing LaShonna and was troubled by the fact that she had told her mother what he was doing the night before, he could have elected to skip work, follow LaShonna to the bus stop, and then accosted her shortly after she entered the convenience store. He may have forcibly abducted LaShonna or convinced her to skip school by not getting on the bus and climbing into his vehicle with him instead. Archie may not have initially been planning to kill LaShonna, but if it became apparent to him that she was going to speak out about things he had done to her in the past, the whole situation could have wound up escalating into violence. Now, what's confusing about this whole situation is that even though the autopsy seemed to indicate that LaShonna died on February the 15th, the same day she disappeared, a forensic entomologist concluded that based on some insect activity in the wooded area where her body was found, LaShonna was originally placed there sometime between February the 18th and the 20th. So does this mean that LaShonna's body was at another location for a few days before she was brought to the woods? I mean, it's possible that the entomologist was mistaken, but I know that red fibers were found inside the trunk of Archie's car, which were consistent with fibers from the red sweatpants LaShonna was wearing when her body was found. By today's standards, fiber evidence is mostly considered to be junk science, but it does seem pretty incriminating that these particular fibers would be in Archie's trunk. If Archie was the killer, and he wasn't initially sure what to do with LaShonna's body, I suppose he could have been brazen enough to keep her in the trunk for a few days before he disposed of her. Another odd detail is that even though LaShonna was found wearing red sweatpants, some of the last witnesses who saw her alive were convinced that she had been wearing black pants. It's certainly possible they misremembered, particularly since LaShonna was not found until several weeks after the fact, but if Teresa was not home on that particular day, a situation could have unfolded in which Archie picked up LaShonna and brought her back to the residence, and for whatever reason, she wound up changing her pants. Well, if incriminating evidence wound up on the black pair of pants, perhaps Archie or whoever the killer was got rid of them, and she was redressed in red sweatpants. Another incriminating detail that might point to Archie is that he used to work at the Indianapolis Fruit Company, which happened to be located right next to the wooded area where LaShonna's body was found. These woods were so dense that they were not easily visible to passersby, which would explain why her body remained undiscovered for a month and a half. If Archie was familiar with this area, it would make sense if he felt this was a good spot to dispose of LaShonna. But ironically enough, this location is the main reason why I still have my suspicions about Charles. At the time, Charles lived in the same neighborhood as LaShonna, and while I found one article which stated that he had been LaShonna's babysitter, I'm not entirely sure that's true, since most of the contemporary articles about Charles's arrest make it sound like he and LaShonna did not know each other. But since Charles had a prior child molestation charge, it's not unreasonable to speculate that if he saw LaShonna around the neighborhood and decided he wanted to assault her, he could have followed LaShonna when she left for school that morning and then abducted her from the alley behind the village pantry store, just like he said during his confession. Following his arrest in 2000, investigators said that they had always considered Charles to be a potential suspect ever since he reported the discovery of LaShonna's body, as he gave a number of conflicting stories about why he entered the wooded area and apparently waited 2 hours before he called 911. Remember, LaShonna's body was not visible from the street, so it sounds like Charles would have needed to walk deep into the woods in order to find her. But of course, the biggest red flag is that Charles lived 8 miles away in the near South Side neighborhood, so what was he doing in the near East Side neighborhood on that particular day? One of his stories is that he wound up in the woods while chasing his girlfriend's dog, but did his girlfriend live in that area? If a local resident found LaShonna, that would be one thing, but if Charles is telling the truth, it sounds like one hell of a coincidence that he would stumble upon the murdered body of a girl from his own neighborhood at a location that neither of them had any apparent connection to. All that being said, despite my misgivings about Charles, I've seen enough cases involving false confessions to know that the one he gave here was likely bogus. You might recall the episode I released a few months ago about the 1988 murder of 4-year-old Barbara Jean Horn, which has a number of parallels with this case. After being relentlessly interrogated for several hours, Walter Ogrod, who also suffered from developmental disabilities, was coerced into giving a false confession to Barbara Jean's murder, though unlike Charles, Walter was wrongly convicted at trial and had to remain behind bars for 28 years before he was finally released and officially exonerated. But much like this case, Walter Ogrod's arrest did not occur until years after the crime originally took place, and it was shortly after the investigation was reassigned to detectives from a cold case unit. I see the same pattern here, as LaShonna's murder had been assigned to veteran detective Roy West, and lo and behold, he soon wound up making an arrest after a suspect with a low IQ made a questionable confession after several hours of interrogation, even though no other corroborating evidence linked him to the crime. It's almost like the IMPD was embarrassed about having the unsolved murder of a child on the books for 6 years and felt the need to pin the crime on someone by any means necessary. I've seen so many cases in which a vulnerable suspect was relentlessly interrogated and told that if they admitted to what they did, they could go home. But this might be the only case I've seen in which the suspect confessed and actually was released from custody and allowed to go home before they were arrested the very next morning, which seems unnecessarily cruel. It's almost like the police needed to take some time to decide whether or not this confession was strong enough evidence to charge him. Obviously, my biggest issue with Charles's confession is that he claimed he raped LaShonna no less than 5 times inside his car at various locations throughout the course of the day, but even though this all supposedly took place in broad daylight, no witnesses reported seeing them together, and there was no seminal fluid or vaginal injuries to indicate that LaShonna had been sexually assaulted at all, let alone raped 5 times. So yeah, that part of Charles's story is most definitely not true, but could this be a case of a guilty man being tricked into giving a confession filled with false details, even though he actually did commit the crime? Well, since I am still bothered by the circumstances of how Charles discovered LaShonna's body, I do wonder if perhaps Charles may not have been directly responsible for this crime, but still knows more than he's letting on. Could it be possible that he heard rumors that LaShonna might be in that wooded area, so he decided to go out there and check for himself, possibly because he craved the attention that would come from being the person to find her? Since there were no apparent signs of sexual assault, I guess my biggest issue with Charles being the perpetrator is that I'm just not sure what his motive would have been. Overall, I do think that Archie just seems like a much more compelling suspect. If his motive was to silence LaShonna for speaking out against abuse he was inflicting upon her, then it would make more sense if Archie decided to kill her without inflicting any further sexual assault. The fact that LaShonna was found with a fractured skull indicates that the killer may have gone into a fit of rage, which points towards this being a more personal crime committed by someone who was known to the victim. However, what I don't understand is why the cold case unit decided to put the brunt of their focus on Charles rather than Archie. Even if the evidence against Archie wasn't strong enough for an arrest or a conviction, I still think there was more evidence, such as the red fibers in his trunk, which pointed towards him than Charles. However, if investigators were desperate to close the case, I could see them going after the suspect with the lowest IQ, who would be more susceptible to making a confession. And if that was their strategy, then they may have muddied up this case so badly that it will be much more difficult, if not impossible, to get a conclusive resolution. After the charges against Charles were dropped, legal experts were saying that if another suspect was arrested at some point, it would be tougher to attain a conviction, since a good defense attorney could always use Charles's prior arrest as a means to generate reasonable doubt for their client because, once again, Charles was never officially exonerated or proven innocent. Of course, over the past several years, DNA testing and genetic genealogy have led to the resolution of a number of cold cases, but since no seminal fluid was found on LaShonna's body or clothing, I'm not even sure if there is any DNA evidence to work with that could conclusively link this crime to a suspect. I do hope that the IMPD have not completely given up on this case because LaShonna led a very tragic life and deserves justice. But even if this case is never conclusively solved, it is comforting to know that the victim's name has been memorialized by the LaShonna Bates Aquatic Center, so at least she will never be completely forgotten. However, it would still be great to get a resolution in this case. So if you happen to have any information about the murder of LaShonna Bates, please contact the Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department's Homicide Unit at 317-327-3475. That's 317-327-3475. You can also call the Crime Stoppers tip line at 317-262-TIPS. That's 317-262-8477. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.werder@icloud.com. That's robin.werder@icloud.com. Now, the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. Over the past 7 years, our Patreon page has released over 80 exclusive bonus episodes, which are all currently available on our archives for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3. This past month, I released a bonus episode about the bizarre story of Monica LeBeau, who discovered that the couple who raised her during her childhood were not actually her birth parents, so she began to suspect that she had been abducted from her real family. I've also dropped an exclusive bonus episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, in which myself and one of my co-hosts, Jules, discuss the 1980 murder of Sherry Jarvis, a victim who was formerly known as the Walker County Jane Doe. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've recorded another new audio commentary track, which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries, and we now have over 70 of these commentary tracks in our archives. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listener who has signed up with us on Patreon this week, Deborah W. Thank you so much for your support. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composed the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter or Instagram, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube Music, Podcast Addict, or whatever your favorite podcasting platform is. Anyway, one final reminder that I will be appearing at AdvocacyCon in Indianapolis this coming weekend, and I hope to get the opportunity to meet some of you folks there. But if not, have yourselves a great week and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.